Welcome, everyone, to the Intergenerational Housing Learning Network. Thank you for joining us here today. You can go ahead and put your name in the chat, your organization, and where you're coming from today. Thank you. So thank you for joining us for the Intergenerational Housing Learning Network. The purpose of this learning network is to learn from people working in the field and work together to promote more intergenerational housing solutions that are accessible to people of all backgrounds and experiences. Next slide. And who are the members of the Intergenerational Housing Learning Network? We are a pretty diverse group. We have program practitioners, housing providers, experts on aging and youth development. We have researchers and advocates. We also have the Kinship Unity Housing Work Group with us today. We also have people living in intergenerational housing and people who oversee intergenerational housing sites like Dorinda, who we will hear from soon. And we have funders and policymakers and government officials as well. And we thank you all for joining us today and our new listeners who are joining us on the webinar as well, who have joined since attending the Blueprint release event. Next slide. What is intergenerational housing? Intergenerational housing is housing that combines people of different ages and offers design features and programming that brings people together to maximize social interaction and promote mutual support. It's that intentional design behind the housing that makes sure that these generations are interacting with one another while living with one another. Next slide. And these are the different types of intergenerational housing models. There's affordable, market rate, supportive housing, university-based retirement communities, as well as intergenerational communities. There's kinship and grandfamilies housing, which is grandparents who are raising their grandchildren full-time, or aunts and uncles who are raising children full-time who aren't the primary parent but have taken on that role and decided to raise them in these communities, as well as home sharing and co-housing, and then of course the naturally occurring multi-generational housing. These are the many types of intergenerational housing models. So this is also our Healthier Lives Across Generations, a blueprint for intergenerational living that was released last year. And this is also a place for you to, it's located on our website, and you can also scan to access the blueprint. This is how we got to the topic of discussion today, which we will bring up on the next slide, but it has excellent resources for those who are interested in intergenerational housing as well as intergenerational living. Next slide. So in the Intergenerational Blueprint, we have provided 4 recommended action steps with different 4 strategies. So the first strategy was to build evidence. The next strategy was to create a compelling narrative. And the third strategy was to advance policy and funding mechanisms. And the 4th strategy was to promote promising practices and design elements. After we had the release event, we received several questions regarding policy, regarding different ways we can push these agendas forward, and just talk more about intergenerational housing as well as intergenerational living. As we saw, lots of people were interested in this topic and were really inspired by the Blueprint release event, as well as all the materials found in the Blueprint. So we're really going to focus on that advancing policy and some of the strategies that were mentioned in the Blueprint, and answer some of those questions that we received after the Blueprint release event that Dorinda will go into more detail with our guest speaker. Next slide. And I'll now hand it over to Dorinda to introduce our next speaker and talk more about today's topic.
Thank you, Ilanka. It's wonderful to be here today with everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to be here. And I am so excited to talk with Linda today, our guest speaker, about policy, so that we can make sure that it's easier to make intergenerational housing across the country. So let me tell you a little bit about Linda. Linda is the Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at LeadingAge. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with LeadingAge, they are a nonprofit organization that serves 5,400 nonprofit and mission-driven aging service providers They use advocacy, education, applied research, and community building to make America a better place to grow old. And if you haven't been to one of their conferences, I highly recommend it. They're always amazing. Linda oversees LeadingAge's policy and advocacy work, which includes understanding what the providers need across the aging services continuum and seeking legislative and regulatory solutions to meet those needs, ensuring that the providers can provide the best to meet the needs of older adults wherever they call home. Linda's background is in federal affordable housing policy, including several years as Vice President for Housing Policy at LeadingAge and more than 15 years at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Linda has a special interest in the federal budget and appropriation processes and has testified before House and Senate committees. That took some bravery. Linda received her undergraduate degree in philosophy from the George Washington University and a master's in public affairs from the University of Connecticut. So join me in warmly welcoming Linda to our event today. So Linda, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, it's always a little painful to hear the full bio, but very kind of you during it. And I'm really, really happy to be here. I'm a huge fan of Generations United, and yep, pleased to be here.
Thank you. Yes, it is always painful to hear our bios read, so thank you for tolerating that. We just want to make sure everybody knows how amazing you are. So let's begin by grounding everybody with what are the federal programs that exist today that provide funding and resources for the development and operation of intergenerational housing. Just set the stage.
All right, we'll set the stage here. There are, lots of federal agencies and departments. Some of them have smaller programs or, offshoot programs. I'm going to talk about 3 agencies that do a lot around affordable housing, that affordable housing providers and developers look to for the bulk of federal programs and federal resources for affordable housing. The first of which is HUD, obviously, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and its largest programs, I think people are probably mostly familiar with or somewhat familiar with, are public housing, which is housing that's, buildings with apartments in them that are owned and operated by the Public Housing Authority. The Housing Choice Voucher Program, and that's a tenant-based rental assistance where if I have a voucher, it's something given to me and administered by the Housing Authority, but then I have a private landlord who accepts the use of that voucher to help pay my rent. And so the housing authorities administer those housing choice vouchers. And then there's also privately owned multifamily housing. So apartment buildings, whether they are family buildings or buildings specifically for older adults or for persons with disabilities, or some mix of those populations that are privately owned by nonprofits or for-profits. And across like those big 3 programs at HUD's largest programs, public housing, housing choice vouchers, again, those are both administered by your local public housing authority, of which there are more than 3,000 of those.
Oh,
and then
wow.
there's the multifamily housing. So this individual contracts between HUD and a private, for-profit or nonprofit owner, and LeadingAge's members are nonprofit owners of this multifamily HUD housing. And that HUD contract says, okay, if you house low-income people, we will give you rent subsidy and money to one point build that housing and then operate it. So that's HUD, and across those programs, that's more than 5 million households. And then there's the low-income housing tax credit program and tax. So yep, it's a Treasury program. And the tax credit program is a federal tax credit that's distributed across all the states. And every state, there are federal parameters about how the low-income housing tax credit can get used, but then states have a lot of flexibility at the state level about how it gives preferences for how those dollars are actually allocated. And that's the biggest driver of new housing in the country today, but it's not the only driver, but it's the biggest. And then the third one I'll mention are rural housing programs at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Those are smaller programs, but they serve a very low-income population and also a very heavily senior and older adult population. So those are the big programs that exist, and those are the 3 agencies that we look to for most federal funding.
And are any of them in all those three? And I'm familiar with the low-income housing tax credits, which is why I made my face. So is there any one of those programs that has an emphasis on the development of intergenerational housing?
At the federal level, the only one of the programs that has an emphasis on intergenerational housing is a multifamily program at HUD called the Section 202 Supportive Housing for the Elderly program. And that's a program where HUD has contracts with private only nonprofit owners to provide affordable senior housing. And for several years now, there's been a small set aside within that program just for intergenerational housing, which has been great. So the 202 program definitely has, captured the attention of intergenerational housing advocates, and there's new housing that's been built through that program.
Yes, and Linda, you were telling us there was a big win this year. There was a press release that LeadingAge put out. Could you share with everybody here what we were bragging about at LeadingAge?
Yeah, so just a few weeks ago, really at the end of the Biden administration, they announced the award of the latest round of Section 202 housing. And the program is nowhere near as big as it needs to be, but of the about 800 units that were awarded funds to get built and then operate for 40 years, were about a little more than 100 of those units will be for intergenerational housing. So it's really wonderful, and we're happy to see HUD take up the mantle that Congress has given it to make awards to intergenerational housing. The only problem with that press release is that we can't look at those and tell which of the awards are intergenerational, and so we're having to kind of go in award by award and see who those great providers are. But that housing, that's money that the 202 program is a beautiful program, and it's great that this intergenerational set aside is within the 202 program. Because in the 202 program, you just have to be very low income, and your income is never too low to live in Section 202 housing. And then if your income fluctuates, your rent fluctuates, but your rent is always affordable to you. And if your income goes down, your rent will go down. Your income goes up, your rent goes up. But it really provides that stability that families need.
Yes, the housing stability, can't say enough of how much that impacts the positive health outcomes, right? Housing truly is health. So I forgot to share there with everybody. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will save time to ask Linda questions. So thank you for asking about the press release, and we will definitely make sure everybody gets that. All right, so how do you think that this blueprint that was created last year, which was so much fun to be a part of, and so important and meaningful, how do you think it shows a path to expand the type of these resources and their funding levels?
So first of all, congratulations to Generations United for the blueprint. I've read it over a few times since it was released, and I had nothing to do with it. There is a part of LeadingAge that was involved in it, our long-term services and support center at UMass Boston. People might know that director of that center, Robin Stone, but Generations United really gets, that's your report anyway. We're just congratulations on that. So that report, I think really in really important ways kind of lays a path and talks about, there are lots of ways that people can think about expanding the supply of housing for intergenerational homes, but also services, right? And so that report talks about expanding the low-income housing tax credit, which, in a one sentence, it's a pretty complicated program, but that program is so important. And so that the more that the intergenerational community understands about the low-income housing tax credit program, that it's a primary source of funding to build and operate housing that works its way into another one of the action steps in the plan, which is to involve yourselves in the qualified allocation plan, which is the way that states actually determine their unique way of distributing and giving priority to the tax credits for low-income housing in their state. That tax credit program is really important. So I was just really happy to see the report acknowledge how important the tax credits are. But the report also, the blueprint talks about services too, because it's not enough to have the housing, right? You want to create these intentional communities. You need the housing and the homes, but you need the space for those intentional connections to happen. And you need some sort of way to either do the service coordination or the services or some mix of both. And where does that funding come in?
Mhm.
Apart from the low-income housing tax credit program, which, as I said, the states can design their own preferences around that within some parameters. The report, I think, I don't know, the blueprint is just so optimistic. One of the action ideas is to urge your housing funds that do exist at the local level to create preferences. And you
Mhm.
might say, oh, there's a public housing program and that's for people who qualify for public housing. Well, public housing authorities can have a preference for certain populations, and it's not every single unit. Maybe has to go to, the next unit available. It could be every 10th unit, right? You can spread the love. The same with the housing choice voucher program. Housing authorities can create preferences. If you can demonstrate to your housing authority that there's a real need in your community, they might really be willing to partner with you to create preferences in that housing. And then the last thing I'll mention in the action plan, and this is a really hot topic in federal affordable housing policy, is the zoning and the local zoning, right? We can't understate the importance of zoning being open and yes, in my backyard, to being able to create and expand the supply of affordable housing. And so making sure that if there's a development, even if it's not yours, that's going to expand the supply of affordable housing, that you're out there supporting it, because next week maybe it's going to be you looking to build a development. So density is good, talking about realistic parking expectations, zoning and being involved in local zoning and supporting multifamily housing is another big part of it. So we need federal dollars, we need state dollars, and we need local zoning flexibility.
So it sounds like you've given us some marching orders to get there to our state legislators and start talking about, and our state agencies, talking about how do we set aside some preference for intergenerational living, because we have so many grandparents raising grandchildren, and or people coming back home to live with parents because they need to save money, or it just makes sense for their family. So you mentioned developers. And so I was wondering, like, who are the developers who should be engaging in this kind of work? If you were going to describe them, like what's qualities or qualifications, sorry, should they have?
Well, you want to be aligned with whoever you're working with, right? Any developer that has experience in the low-income housing tax credit program, successful experience, is going to be a better partner, but that's not enough, right? You want to make sure that you understand and you share the same goals, right? There are developers' fees that come about by getting a tax credit award secured. What's going to happen to those fees? How are services going to be paid for? Who's going to pay for those things? There's a lot to get worked out about, like, actually what happens in a development, and whether it's a tax credit development or building housing without any federal subsidy. I think working with a developer that really understands the design features that you're looking for, the landscaping features that are important to you, the community spaces that are important, and how intermingled the homes are, that they're not walled off from each other, and you just have to be on the same page. That said, as far as tax credits, obviously, you're going to need someone with tax liability, right? And so if you have a nonprofit developer, you have to work, and there's all kinds of there's a whole world set up there out there to do this. You have to work with someone who's going to help you sell those tax credits to investors who need those tax credits to offset their tax liability, because a nonprofit developer doesn't have that tax liability. But then you use the cash from the sale of those tax credits to actually build the housing. And that's, in a very weak nutshell, how the tax credit program works. And so, for-profit developer or nonprofit developer, the most important thing is that, you're aligned on your goals, and you have an eye on preservation and that you're in it for the long haul, right?
Mhm. Yeah, so important to have that mission alignment, so that when if you're a nonprofit developer working with a for-profit developer, it's so important to start at the beginning. Don't draw anything, don't draw up any documents and say, okay, this is what's important to us. So many times there's been experiences where your community room is too big. Okay, well, don't argue with me about that because I know how important that community room. And then I hear you also say, Linda, how important it is to have to have the developer fee. And I think, sometimes if if a nonprofit partners with a for-profit, the nonprofit team is bringing their expertise, their knowledge, and I'm going to say deserve, but it's so important to have that developer fee as well.
And the other thing I'll mention too, being on the same page with is, who are you looking to serve? Like, what's the mission of your particular organization? What are your goals? And by that, I'm really getting at income targeting. Like, what household incomes are you hoping to serve? Because you can submit an application that kind of serves different levels of incomes through the low income housing tax credit application process. And you could also be working in addition with your local housing authority to get vouchers into some of those units or all of those units to bring down the incomes that you're targeting even deeper to, where the need is the greatest, while ensuring that those rents are affordable on an ongoing basis. And the wherewithal to go through all those regulations and paperwork is really driven by that alignment on mission, I think.
It does, yes, and it is not for the faint-hearted to go through that process. But you just keep all of those dear people in mind as you're going through that process, and it pulls you through. Linda, a lot you mentioned also about services, and that is a topic that it gets discussed all the time, that you can't just in affordable housing circles, you can't just build the housing and then walk away and say, oh, hope you all 3 generations get along okay. Good luck with things. People need support, and but oftentimes the rent that is charged is not a lot left over to help pay for the services. So could you talk about how those get funded? Typically what you've seen?
So specifically what we've seen, and it really is a whole basket of different things. So sometimes the developer fee will help, right? Do that. Sometimes there's just fundraising and foundation work that is a part of that. Sometimes it's the low income housing tax credit program itself. Some states will provide, will literally like push more tax credits into every unit so that the subsidy in those units is richer to provide for some of supportive services funding is one way to do that. Partnering, having MOU with community service organizations, and by maybe inviting a broader community in at the same time helps them achieve some of the physical aspects that they need while, they want to serve people too, but maybe bring in some more people from the community. So MOUs with local agencies that already have a structure and services dollars. We've seen a lot of emphasis on service coordination, coordinating services that already exist in the community and bringing those in rather than recreating the whole services wheel, being effective. But you're definitely going to need some money, and you want it to be there for the long term because, no one wants to stop and start the services aspect of this housing. But there are some resources out there at the federal level and in the Section 202 program. That program funds a service coordinator in those developments, and you can get some money, a certain amount of money per unit per month to actually do supportive services. So there are some services dollars out there. They're not as much as we want, but they do exist because I think that there's a acknowledgement that services help people be healthier, help younger people do well in school, help with job attainment, and help on the asset management side of the property.
Yes.
Turnover and those kind of things. So service coordination services is just a plus for everybody.
It really is. And you really have an opportunity to bring the generations together and have meaning and purpose and a sense of belonging and reducing ageism, hopefully. And so we can't say it enough. And I'm really proud of the blueprint for recognizing and emphasizing the need for services. And thank you for all those ways. And I'm delighted to hear that the 202, not only was it for the housing, it was for the services. So you're teaching us something really important today. So, all right. So now we talked about what we can use. We talked about services. All right, now we're going to go to, okay, what gets in our way, Linda? What are the barriers that are getting in our way for us to do the intergenerational housing?
Well, in general, a big barrier for any kind of multifamily housing is NIMBYism, right? That is an acronym for not in my backyard. There's been a counter movement over the years called YIMBYism, right? Yes, in my backyard.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, NIMBYism and just a beatback, a pushback against multifamily housing, period, which is why that local zoning work is so important. But plenty of organizations have figured out how to successfully build partnerships and to really educate the community about who's in the who the development is aimed for, who the management company is, you know, how's that building going to be run, what's the, you know, what do the grounds look like, what's the parking like. And so, you know, that can be overcome usually, but that can be a big hurdle. The bigger hurdle is getting those dollars, right? These are highly competitive programs. There is in no way enough money to go around, right? Obviously, we have a severe affordable housing shortage in this country. Now, if you're not looking to do affordable housing, you're looking to do market rate housing, you won't have that same issue. But you know, I see a thread through the blueprint of trying to increase the supply of affordable housing. So resource scarcity, NIMBYism are two things, but I think tenacity has proven itself to be able to win out quite a few times.
No. One of the strategies that we've done to face NIMBYism is that there's a point in our design development where we'll have a neighborhood committee join us for several weeks to just keep tweaking the design. And then they can feel as though they had a voice and a say, and now they feel a little bit of ownership. And then they get to know us and know that we're just regular people and that the people who live in our buildings are regular people. And I know I jokingly say the kids in Bridge Meadows don't get from A to B without an elder going, does your mother know what you're doing? And so they're like the natural neighborhood watch people. So, all right. So our last question, and because there are some really awesome questions in the chat, so I want to get to those. So, but why don't we just wrap up our part with, what do you see as the future of intergenerational housing in light of the aging population and the changing family structure in many countries?
The data, like from the census and projections from the Urban Institute and other like researchy think tanks, tell us that we are becoming like a housing stock that is more intergenerational, right? More multi-generational. So I think that that's where our families are going, right? Like less white, less wealthy, less owner, right? We're gonna have fewer owners in the future. That's what the projections say.
Wow.
And when you combine all that, it's, you know, our housing stock has to stop being, you know, 3,500 square foot single home aspirational and be much more realistic to what people need. And, you know, the census data show like a big bump in the number of intergenerational families over the last, you know, 10 years. And so we think that trend will continue, and it's mostly in the South and in different pockets. But we see that going north, right? We see the kind of the migration of the intergenerational families moving north. So we see a lot of retrofitting of existing homes to become more intergenerational friendly, and the development, we hope, of new housing to be much more intergenerational, which includes being much more accessible and visitable, right? We've got to make these, you know, housing that we're building and retrofitting to be able to be used by everyone.
Yes, we're planning for how we want to age, right?
Right.
And how we want to. Yes, I've noted that even the market rate world is creating more intergenerational living. The Lennar homes have multi-generational housing. They've been doing it for 20 years. And I figure, well, if a for-profit developer like that is doing it,
Right.
it's got some legs, right? It's not just this nice social service thing. It's got some legs because it's based on census data. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so Linda, let's switch to our friends who here are on here in the chat, and I'm going to start with Victory. Victory's first question is: do you believe that all the changes happening in Washington D.C. are going to affect the low-income programs? I know that's been a discussion here in Oregon this week.
Yeah. So, and I assume it means like the new administration, the new Congress, and yes, we do. You know, this is an administration that's been really clear and was clear in its first round that it's not a fan of most HUD programs, right? It really, and the HUD secretary nominee testified a week and a half ago in the Senate, and it's this message that we're fighting against, that we'll continue to fight against for a few more years, is that how can we spend the billions of dollars we're spending and have homelessness go up and have the shortage of affordable housing go up? Therefore, the money that we're spending must not be working, and why are we throwing good money after bad? And of course, our argument is that, is that we've never spent enough. We've never even come close to catching up to where we should be. If people studied the HUD funding back in the mid 70s and the late 70s, when we were issuing 250,000 vouchers, new vouchers every year. Like, how did we think we got to having, 2 million vouchers in this country? It's because we were pushing out, and then all of a sudden that stopped. And then anyway, so I think that if we were able to ramp back up, but anyway, this is, I think this is an administration that's come in with clear goals to decrease federal funding and to really assess sort of what I would see as a lot of federal social safety net programs and their value. We are hopeful, of course, that funding for older adults and children will be seen as an investment, right? And good education, investment in jobs, and investment in keeping people out of nursing homes. And housing people in the community where people want to live. So we'll see, but yeah, we're worried. The previous administration asked for cuts and to all the HUD programs, including the flagship senior housing program, the 202 program, and other HUD programs that help build and support housing. So we're ready to be on the defensive, but we're advocates and lobbyists, we've got to be glass half full people, otherwise we wouldn't come back to work. So.
Yeah. What are some of the specific things that LeadingAge is doing to address that matter?
So we have we have a policy platform that actually our board is meeting on Thursday to approve for the coming year. And if I had to guess, I think like in the housing space, we are going to continue to ask for a robust money to build housing, right? We think that we need it. We're not asking for everything we want. We're asking for what we see as a modest amount to continue to expand the supply. Another thing that we're doing is we're asking for new vouchers explicitly for older adults that can be tied to any private apartment, or you can use them wherever, but developers can also project base or stick a voucher onto a property. So Dorinda has a 50-unit property. If she can stick vouchers to 10 of those and create immediately extremely affordable housing for the lowest income households. And with that, you're preventing homelessness, you're ending homelessness, and then services, right? We have a pretty big agenda around more service coordinators, but also protecting Medicaid, so that the people who are in, about 2/3 of HUD assisted older adults are duals and are on Medicare and Medicaid, and that's another fight we know we're up against this year, is maintaining Medicaid funding and access to Medicaid.
Thanks for sharing all that. I look forward to seeing that announced to the membership.
Yep.
All right. So Philip has a question. Do you think the 202 Intergenerational Housing Program will be announced for another round? Do you think it'll be around? I love this. Any scuttlebutt?
So this is the end of January. The federal fiscal year 25 started last October. So we still don't have a funding bill for this year. And we're still under this continuing resolution, which means we're being funded at last year's levels still. And Congress has given itself until March 14th to decide what this year's funding will look like. And the House bill, there's a House bill, there's a Senate bill, and they're different. The House bill has no money for new 202 housing. The Senate bill has about the same amount as last year, about $110 million or so. Not a lot of money, but we're happy for it. And right now, I think that House and Senate Republicans and Democrats are negotiating those bills. And because the Republicans are in charge of both chambers right now, which they weren't when these bills were originally drafted last summer, all of that could change. And so we expect to see that Republican majority like thumb on the scale of these bills. And we're worried that there won't be another round of funding for a couple of years. Again, we're trying to couch this the program as an investment, and the homelessness data have just are increasing for all populations. And so
Yes.
to walk away and say, oh well, what we did wasn't working, we don't think is a moral or viable solution.
So stay tuned.
Stay tuned. And if you see an action alert, respond to it. Take that 3 minutes and respond to that action alert, because members of Congress need to hear that these programs are important to you and that you're watching how they're voting on them.
Oh, good advice. And then Philip wants to know, how does the NOFA for HUD funding in the community projects congressional funding program get out?
Ooh, those are the earmarks. They don't use that term, but I think that's what he's talking about, Philip, right? I see your, yeah. So how that works, every year, so we're, the 25 bill, who knows if that's really over or not, but let's say we're just working on the FY 26 bill for the year that starts this October 1st. At some point, the House and Senate leadership will decide whether or not they want those earmarks, those community funding projects in their bills or not. And there's always a lot of back and forth. But what you need to do, sometimes the Senate says yes and the House says no, they both say yes. But that is a very office-driven, like congressional or Senate office-driven project. And so you've got to go early and often and work with both your district office back home and your DC office to express to them why you need what you need, how much you need, the impact of it. We've seen organizations go with letters of support, letters of recommendation from all their grass tops, their mayors, all their community leaders. So, and they have their own deadlines, right? So you have to watch and make sure you're aware of their deadlines. But yeah, that's a whole process, and it's yet to be determined if those are even going to be allowable next year, but we'll see.
Yeah. It's always a waiting game and on pins and needles. So Chelsea's wondering, could you elaborate on the requirements for 202 intergenerational housing, and would different types of intergenerational housing be eligible? So we'll have to ask Chelsea to share with us what different types means, but at least could you answer the first part?
So the basic parameters of the Section 202 program apply to just senior housing and the intergenerational set aside within the 202 program. And those are eligible grantees are all nonprofits. That's one of the rules. And the people served are very low income households. And in HUD speak, very low income means that your household income is at or below 50% of the area median income. So the households you have to serve households below 50%, and you have to commit to doing that in the 202 program for 40 years, after which those contracts are renewable. And then, the application is replete with environmental requirements and, You don't get all the money to build it, right? It used to be back in the heyday of the 202 program, the 202 award would come and it would give you all the money you needed to build the housing and then all the money to operate it for 40 years. Now you get all the money to operate it for 40 years, which is the golden ticket of this program because you
Yes.
serve the lowest income people for 40 years, but you only get a portion of what it costs to build it. So you've got to know how to pull in other resources like the home program or the community development block grant program or the tax credit program. And it's hard, and that's like that capital stack people talk about, it has to get layered up. But people do it, and if other people do it, people on this call can figure out how to do it.
Yeah, I call it a mosaic. Like the real estate development consultants call it a stack, and I'm like, no, it's a mosaic because some is like tiny money and some's like humongous money. Yeah. So Phil Balls had a question about, does HUD ever fund dispersed housing? We've wondered about this too, Philip. Does it ever do like one project in multiple smaller buildings scattered out about a city?
I think that's more, I would envision that more. I don't see the 202 program doing that because that's really is a multifamily housing program. And I'm so curious to see this latest round with all these intergenerational units. And I think this is the largest 202 round that's the largest amount of intergenerational units in any 202 award round. For dispersed housing, I would really look to the voucher program and working with your local housing authority. They administer all the well, not all of them, but most of the housing choice vouchers, and they can project-based, we're saying, like stick a certain number of those in a long-term contract onto a building and make that unit or those couple of units in that building affordable. And it could be in a single family home, right? And so you could see like scattered site housing done that way, and they can do that with up to 20% of their vouchers. And so there's quite a bit of wiggle room they have there to do that. And some housing authorities are at their cap, but most of them aren't. So that's like one way I would see. And I see Beverly's question about so in the 202 program, no, it doesn't have to be new build. That money often gets used to renovate or repurpose an existing unaffordable building, and maybe even old school or a mill or a apartment building that was vacant, and renovate that and make it into a beautiful renovated 202 building.
Linda, one of the things we're seeing is that the average median income levels are out of whack with what money people actually have. And so how that shows up is an elder may overqualify for a 50% average median income, and they're trying to but they're right under 60, and so they'll stretch, to try and live in a 60, but then they end up in a, not having enough food. We help them with that, everybody. So just know, but that's the rub. And so can you talk a little bit about how the AMI is out of whack with reality?
So there's a lot packed in there for me, Dorinda. And first of all, Dorinda's talking about the low-income housing tax credit program, and you might have seen in like a rental ad, they'll have a chart, right? You qualify for this unit. If you're a single person household, your income is between, I don't know, 25 and 30, whatever, and they'll have this little chart. And so, right. And so the tax credit program mostly serves households at 50 or 60% of area median. And you've got to be in that pretty narrow window to qualify to live in that unit. And then if you're in that unit, your most tax credit housing, and some states do it differently, and some providers are able to do it differently. When you're in that unit, your rent, unlike in HUD programs, unlike in the 202 program, is not based on your household income. It's based on that area's median household income. And so as Dorinda was saying, so that rent might not be affordable to every single household, but it's sort of because of the scarcity of the housing that's out there, it's better than being homeless, and it's better than spending 99% of your income on your housing, right? And so we see this all the time. And so the tax credit program has tried to adjust in a way by rolling out a few years ago the income averaging approach, right? Which says that instead of saying the developer is going to target households at 50% of area median or households at 60% of area median, it allows the developers to say across the whole property, all the units, we're going to have incomes that average 60%, which allows you to serve higher income households, which, you know, there's communities definitely that have a need up to 80% at area median. But to get to that average of 60, you have to go lower. And in those properties, you also can increase the subsidy in those lower income units and make those rents affordable. I don't know if that answers your question, but the tax credit program wasn't built, right, to be like as affordable as the HUD program. So I don't want to blame it for not working well that way, but that's why we like vouchers, right? You can double down and bring a voucher in a tax credit unit, then everyone's happy. But again, there are a long waiting list for vouchers.
I appreciate you explaining that, because it's just something that we've run into most recently. The other thing we've run into most recently here in the Pacific Northwest is there are no vouchers to be had, that the housing authority is actually worried about how they're going to attend to the vouchers that they've already, you know, set out to give out. And so what recommendations do you have about that? Do you have any, Linda, other than knocking on doors?
You know, I mentioned that, you know, we're trying to finalize the FY25 bill by mid-March. And the House bill is worse, but the Senate bill for funding existing vouchers is $800 million short, right? That's hundreds of, you know, I don't know, tens of thousands of vouchers short. And so, you know, housing authorities will be making decisions. And we know some housing authorities are, you know, have stopped attrition, right? When someone hands in a voucher, they're not turning that voucher over to the next household on the waiting list because they don't have the money, or they're worried they're not going to have the money. Because the last thing a housing authority wants to do is go to an already voucher assisted household that has a lease with a landlord already is in there and say, you know what, we're sorry, but you can't stay here anymore. And so it really is it is federal funding, right? These vouchers aren't cheap. And no surprise, right? They exist because housing is so out of whack with people's incomes. And so the voucher program is in desperate need of adequate renewal funding. And we're going to rely on this new HUD to tell Congress the right number it needs. Right. And so we rely on every administration to be honest with Congress about the voucher renewal needs. And housing authorities are desperate to make sure that they have the resources they need to fund the vouchers out there. But we know that, you know, housing authorities, people get a couple of months traditionally to look around for an apartment. And, you know, we've seen over the last few weeks, housing authorities pulling back those vouchers that are in search mode because housing authorities aren't sure about future funding.
Yes, and then the domino effect is dear people who need the housing aren't able to get the housing because they need the voucher. And then those of us developing can't operate without that income. And so so I what I hear I'm taking away, Linda, is this is what I need to be talking to the congressman about. Congressman,
Don't be shy. Don't be shy to call your office, you know, the board and say, hey, I know we've got a housing crunch here. Be nice to HUD, you know.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, so Philip's got another question. What regulations or laws are in place that simply allow a resident senior to have a young relative or a grandchild in a second bedroom?
So,
we have that.
Like someone, you know, when I started working in affordable senior housing, someone was like, well, why can't we just live in a 202 unit? And it wasn't like the 202 program needed this revolution of statutory changes to make it have a set aside for intergenerational housing. They can be 2 bedrooms. It is fine, right? There's no and so you have to have one person in that household who's over 62, and then you can have other people living in there. And it's just that they're set up, most of them, as Philip says, as you know, they're all 1 bedrooms, and some of the older ones are efficiencies. But yeah, so these intergenerational ones will be 2 bedroom or 3 bedroom, hopefully some of them 4 or 5 bedrooms. But it is, as long as one person that had a household is over 62, they're eligible to be in that unit.
Yes, we actually have examples of that. We have affordable housing for elders and affordable housing for families in our communities. And we do have grandparents raising grandchildren. They're raising one, and they are in what we would say the elder housing, and the kids in the second bedroom. So it meets the child welfare needs. It meets the, you know, the housing requirements. And so, all right, Rainey, my friend, has a question or saying something. She's saying, in Atlanta, there's no new vouchers. No new vouchers have been issued in decades. Oh, that's incredibly sad. When the program moves to get on the wait list for a voucher, it's only for a short time and it's gone in a few hours. So no one's getting vouchers. Can anything be done to get the housing authority to increase the number of vouchers? Great,
Yep.
great question.
Great point. And right, the housing authorities open their waiting, if they're closed, they open these waiting lists and they get 30,000 people apply to get onto the waiting list or to enter a lottery to get onto the waiting list. It's very frustrating. The only way housing authorities will get more vouchers is when Congress approves funding to expand the number of vouchers. That's it. Housing authorities can't create new vouchers, right? They can't say, oh, you know what, let's give everyone half a subsidy and double the number of vouchers. That's not right. They have to go by the, you know, the value of the voucher, and we don't want them to do that anyway. And so it's completely reliant on Congress. And that's why advocacy matters so much. And that's why, you know, we want more vouchers. And as you heard me just say, we are struggling to make sure we have enough money in this current year's budget to fund the vouchers that are out there, not to mention to expand.
Yes.
And so, you know, like as an advocate, like I think, you know, we got to defend the base, right? We have to all the units we currently have, but then we need more, and we desperately need more. And so the march is always on.
Yes. All right, Chelsea, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on my second question.
Thank you.
I was referring to, you know, we work on a variety of intergenerational housing models that some aren't with relatives and children living in the same household. And I was curious if I thought that the intergenerational section 202 housing is only eligible for like caregivers that have a child living with them, or would it be applicable to other types of intergenerational?
Yeah, Chelsea, I'm not sure. Like if I don't know what the relationship would have to be. We can go back and look at the notice of funding opportunity to look at that. But I will say that if there's an intergenerational housing, let me just say, is really popular on Hill. And so I think this is like a good mode. This is a good way to expand the 202 program, is keeping that set aside in there. But, you know, we would support getting guidance from Generations United about making sure that the kind of intergenerational housing that the set aside in the 202 program supports is the kind that really meets the needs of, you know, the blueprint.
Yeah, so, well, thank you everybody for those questions. And Linda, a round of applause. Thank you so much for all that great knowledge for all of us and the encouragement. And I think the biggest takeaway is talk to your elected officials and tell them stories about people who are not getting what they need, and pay attention to Generations United advocacy and LeadingAge advocacy. Read the blueprint, and stay in touch with each other, because it really does take a village to do this, and we really need to be that strong voice advocating on behalf of folks so that they can have the housing they deserve, because we know health is housing. So
Brenda, thank you so much. And Ilanka, thank you. And Adina, nice to meet you. And thank you too. And huge thanks to all Generations United does. Appreciate you.
Well, we appreciate you. Ilanka, I'll turn it back to you for closing us out.
Thank you, Dorinda. Thank you, Linda. Thank you both for joining us today and having this wonderful conversation and letting us get some important information. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We do hope that you enjoyed the webinar today. And I did drop a link in the chat to get the direct link to the blueprint. So if anyone wants to go look at it, and then we also have the wonderful event that took place to go over the blueprint in more detail, where we had a group of panelists come and dive more into the blueprint as well. And also, here's my contact information if anyone has any questions regarding intergenerational housing or the Intergenerational Housing Learning Network, as well as Dorinda's website as well for Bridge Meadows, and also the link to Generations United website as well. We just want to thank everyone for joining us today and coming out, and hope you had an informative discussion and we're able to gain some important information regarding this topic. And we will keep these important topics going. And thank you for everyone who is here, and have a great rest of your day.